Hello, my name is Jamie Ellis, and I'm a professor at the University of Florida in the Entomology and Nematology Department. It's my pleasure to be speaking to you all the way from Florida about worker honeybee tasks. So before I do that, I just want to give you a little bit of an overview of the University of Florida. We have about 55,000 students at the University of Florida, and our Entomology and Nematology Department is the largest such department in the United States. There's about 70 professors in our department, and I'm one of those. And of course, my specialty is with honeybees. Personally, I have been a beekeeper since the age of 12, so it's about 30 years now. I grew up in Georgia in the United States of America and have really traveled all around the world studying honeybees, working with honeybees, speaking to beekeepers and bee clubs all over the place. So it's really my pleasure to be able to join you guys today during your conference. So given that I'm talking about the tasks of worker honeybees, I want to share with you what I hope that you learn by the time this talk is over. My focus is to help you be able to recognize the general order of tasks that worker bees perform relative to their age, as well as identify worker bee tasks that are independent of age. In other words, I want you to know what worker honeybees do and why they do it so that you can appreciate the marvel that is the worker honeybee. And anytime I start a talk about worker honeybees, I always start with this slide. And it's the most complicated slide that you're going to see in the whole presentation. But given that I'm speaking to beekeepers, I'm sure that you are all very familiar with this topic. As you all know, there are three types of bees in a honeybee colony. They are the queen, the drones, and the worker bees. Now, you know, if you look at this uppermost image here, a queen can lay an egg and she can control whether that egg is fertilized or if that egg remains unfertilized. And they can do this because when queens mate, they store the semen from the drones with which they mate in a special organ in their body. That organ is called the spermatheca. So while queen bees are laying eggs, they can elect to release semen and fertilize those eggs that are passing out of their bodies, or they can withhold semen and keep those eggs unfertilized as those eggs pass out of their body. Of course, all of you know that unfertilized eggs ultimately become drone honeybees or the male honeybees. So male honeybees have only mothers. They have no fathers. So that's a really interesting fact about drone honeybees. They're really an interesting bee in general. And if the queen elects to fertilize that egg, it becomes a female. And that's really the limit of the control that queens have. They can produce female offspring and they can produce male offspring, but that is it. The worker honeybees then will take that female offspring and either feed it a lot of high quality food, in which case it becomes a queen, or they feed it less low quality food, in which case it becomes a worker. So the way to think about queens and workers is queens are basically overfed workers, workers are underfed queens. Now, if I were with you face to face giving this presentation, there's an analogy that I like to use to explain what's happening here. And I want you to think about it just from a very practical standpoint. Queens have all the genes necessary to have been a worker. I mean, the workers could have made that female offspring a worker. Instead, they fed it a lot of royal jelly and it became a queen. Likewise, that same female, if they feed a little bit, becomes a worker. So workers have all the genes necessary to be a queen. So queens could have been workers, workers could have been queens. So you have a clear example of how it's not the genes that these bees have that make them queens or workers, because they both have the same genes. Rather, it's the expression of those genes. And the analogy that I always give is imagine that you're sitting in an auditorium, right in the very center of that large auditorium. On the left, let's say you have 5 lights from the back of the room to the front of the room, and on the right, you have 5 lights from the back of the room to the front of the room. So basically on the right side, the first light, and on the left side, the first light are the same type of light, the same quality of light, can produce the same intensity of light, and lights 2 and 2 the same, and lights 3 and 3 all the way down to light 5. Now imagine again on both sides of the room that there is a switch for each light. So on the right side of the room, there's a switch that controls light 1, a switch that controls light 2, a switch that controls light 3, a switch that controls light 4, and one that controls light 5. And likewise, on the left side of the room, you get exactly the same thing, a switch for each of the lights. Now, imagine that I come into that room and ask you to leave that room, and you're gone for 5 minutes. And while you're gone, I go to the right side of the room and flip on switches 2 and 4, but leave off switches 1, 3, and 5. And then I go to the left side of the room and switch on switches 1, 3, and 5, but leave off 2 and 4, exactly the opposite of what I did on the right. And I invite you back in, you return to the middle of that auditorium, and you look to the right and you look to the left, and you would say both halves of the room are lit differently, right? But the funny thing is about these halves of the room is I could have flipped those switches on and matched patterns exactly. I could have had both light switches 1 on. I could have had both sides light switches 3 on, and so forth, but I didn't. I did 2 and 4 on one side, 1, 3, and 5 on the other. Well, that, boys and girls, is exactly what happens with queens and workers. They both have the same lights. They both are otherwise capable of having the same lights on or off with the same intensity or lack thereof of each light. The difference is queens have certain lights switched on and other lights switched off, while worker bees have some lights switched off, but other lights switched on. Basically, it's not the genes that control the difference per se. It's the turning off and on of those genes that make queens and workers. And that's one of the reasons that female bees, to me, are among the most fascinating insects on planet Earth, female honeybees, that is. Because just by turning off and on switches, you get a queen bee that can live 2 years, whose most complicated behavior is to go out on a mating trip. But for the rest of her life, she only lays eggs. Whereas worker bees, they've got a huge suite of behaviors. They're capable of doing all kinds of things. But they could have been a queen. It's amazing to think about it. We call this epigenetics. The best way to teach it is, let's say again, you leave that room, that auditorium, and while you're gone, I flip on and off light switches on both sides of the room, and then I put a cover on top of those switches so that no one else can turn those on and off. They're either locked on or locked off. And epigenetics, the epi means there's something above the gene that controls the expression of the gene, just like there's a cover that controls the expression of that light switch. I've flipped the switch, I've put a cover on it, and now it can't be controlled. Well, epigenetics happens similarly in queens and workers. There's a switch on the gene, and it's either on or off, and then you get workers or queens from the same genes, from the same female egg. All right, that's the study of epigenetics. Epi means above, so things above the genes responsible for the expression of those genes. So we got this really complex reproduction system. You've got females coming from diploid eggs or fertilized eggs. You've got males coming from unfertilized eggs or haploid eggs. And so as a result, this sex determination system is called haplodiploid sex determinant. Males are haploid, females are diploid. This is as complicated as I'm going to get in this presentation. The reason, though, that I like to start with this slide is because I really want to hammer home how amazing queen and worker bees are, given that both could have been the other. Now, this is a talk about the suite of behaviors that worker bees exhibit, but I just as easily could be giving you a talk about what queen bees do and then amaze you with the fact that both came from the same type of egg. So let's look at this a little further. When a queen lays an egg, about 3 days later, a female offspring will come out of that egg if that egg is indeed fertilized. So we get what we call larvae, right? So honeybees undergo complete metamorphosis. So you have eggs, larvae, pupae, and adults. And in this stage, you have the larval stage. They lie in the back of their cell in the shape of the letter C. Some beekeepers here call them C-shaped larvae. Other people call these larvae milk brood because they're sitting in a pool of brood food and it looks milky in appearance. So when we say C-shaped larvae or milk brood, we're talking about the youngest of larvae that honeybees undergo. From there, we get prepupae. That's when the larvae have finished eating. The bees will cap over their cells and those larvae will stand up, which is what you see in this image in the bottom right. So that technically is a larval stage, but it's the larval stage immediately before the pupal stage. So we call it the pre-pupal stage. They spend a couple of days as prepupae and then molt or shed their skin and become pupae. So you can see in the top of that bottom left image, you can see the youngest of pupae. It's still white. And as you go down that image, you see darkening pupae, darkening pupa. And at the very bottom, you get an adult bee that, if you're a worker, will emerge from its cell 21 days after being laid. Now, it's amazing to think about honeybee development, but since this is a talk on worker bees, I want to emphasize how super cool worker bees are. So worker bees go from egg to adult while passing through a worm stage in 21 days. And when they emerge at 21 days, they are programmed and ready to perform the tasks that they were born to do. So I want to talk briefly, before I even get to the tasks of the worker bee, I want to talk briefly about honeybee development, specifically worker bee development, so that you can get a full appreciation for how amazing workers are. Because honeybees are insects, they have to shed their skin or their exoskeleton as they develop. And that's because their exoskeleton is on the outside of their body. So as they grow, they cannot grow because the exoskeleton limits their growth. So they will shed it. And that shedding of their exoskeleton is called molting. So while this table looks complicated, it's fairly simple. Basically, the life stage in column A undergoes the transformation in column B to become the life stage in column C. Now, I've told you that honeybees will shed their skin. This is true of workers as well. The period between molts is called the instar. It's the growth period of the bee before it sheds its exoskeleton. So let me give you an example of what's happening in this table. When a worker or a female egg is laid, you get an egg. A larva emerges from that egg, and it is now a first instar larva. That first instar larva will eat, shed its skin or molt, and become a second instar larva. The second instar larva eats, molts, becomes a third instar larva. The third instar larva eats, molts, becomes a fourth. The fourth instar larva eats, molts, and at that molt, it becomes the prepupae. This is the stage that develops under the cell capping. That fifth instar larva, that larva that's standing up, the prepupae, it molts a fifth time and becomes the sixth instar individual, which is a pupa. Then it remains in that capped cell as a pupa, at which point, nearing its immersion as an adult bee, will shed its pupal skin. We call that eclosion. When an insect sheds its pupal skin, it ecloses, and it becomes an adult bee. So this talk is about the task of a worker honeybee, but I really wanted you to appreciate how marvelous worker bees are. These last three slides, the slides where I'll show you, the haplodiploid reproduction system, the images of worker honeybees progressing from egg to adult, and now talking to you specifically about what happens as they develop from egg to adult while they molt and undergo these different instar stages. What I'm just trying to do is set the stage for you to appreciate the marvel that is the worker honeybee. Now, I could be giving a similar talk for queens and drones. They undergo similar stages of development. But workers are fascinating because all of what you're seeing on this slide happens before the bee even emerges from its cell. So when we talk about the behaviors of worker honeybees, everybody simply wants to think about their behaviors as adult bees, but they undergo a lot of behavioral transformation while they're babies. They eat and grow and molt. They eat and grow and molt. They eat and grow and molt and molt and molt and so forth until they come out as an adult bee. Now, let's talk about that adult bee. You're going to notice in this presentation that I have a lot of really good images. Some years ago, I paid a PhD student in our department, Mike Bentley, who's now a Dr. Mike Bentley, to take these pictures for us. He really liked photography, and he was really keen to take some images of honeybees for us so that we could use them in presentations like this one. So I hope you enjoy those images. I wanted to point them out to you because a lot of these slides will have pictures from Dr. Bentley on them, and I just wanted you to be able to appreciate them. This particular bee is particularly interesting because she is a worker bee that has the cordovan phenotype. So one genetic mutation makes it where her exoskeleton, where it would normally be brown or black, it is red. So in this particular phenotype, we get a red or incredibly light colored honeybee. All right. So worker honeybees subscribe to a system, a behavioral system that we call temporal polyethism. Temporal means time, poly means many, ethism means behavior. So temporal polyethism means timed many behaviors. All right. So honeybees exhibit reproductive division of labor. That means there's a queen that does all the reproducing while the workers do all the other tasks. And these tasks are performed in an age-related system. In fact, beekeepers, we call this age-related division of labor. Most of us don't use the words temporal polyethism unless we're in some sort of science class. But for purposes of this presentation, I wanted to introduce you to the concept of temporal polyethism and let you know that you probably know this term more as age-related division of labor. All right. So this age-related division of labor is what's going to fill the rest of this presentation, thinking about it, explaining it, and trying to understand it. I once wrote a column for the American Bee Journal, which is one of our large national bee publications. And in that particular journal, I was writing a series of articles on honeybee behavior and biology. And I had to do a lot of research to study worker honeybee tasks. And one of the things that was fascinating to me is when in leading up to writing this particular article on honeybee tasks, I believed that every worker honeybee performed every worker task throughout her adult life, and that those tasks were incredibly rigid. She progressed from one to the next in a very rigid and predictable fashion. And what I discovered when I was doing research for that article, and now that's turned into this presentation, I've discovered that that is not the case. Not all worker honeybees perform all tasks. And not all worker bees perform all tasks the same amount of time. Some worker bees skip tasks. Some worker bees might even go backwards in tasks. Some worker bees may perform multiple tasks at the same age. So a lot of what follows in this discussion is going to be an overview of the standard progression of tasks and the standard ages bees are when they perform these tasks. And I want you to remember throughout that these are not rigid. They're not locked in place. And you'll understand a lot of that once I finish this presentation, because I'm going to emphasize it throughout my time with you. All right. So the tasks of worker honeybees are largely split into 4 categories: cell cleaning and capping, brood and queen tending, comb building, cleaning, and food handling, and outside tasks. And as bees age, they generally do tasks in group 1, followed by tasks in group 2, followed by tasks in group 3, and so on. This progression, their movement through these tasks, is regulated by physiology. In other words, the chemicals that they have pumping through their bodies. It's regulated by hormones, right? Those chemicals through their bodies. It's regulated by the needs of the colony and environmental conditions. So collectively, physiology, hormones, pheromones, colony needs, and environmental conditions are ultimately collectively what help push bees through these series of tasks and helps them move to the tasks that are needed at any given point in time in the life of a honeybee colony. So probably many of you have seen this graphic from Mark Winston's 1987 book, The Biology of the Honeybee. It's a really good book. And as I've shared with you, there are 4 general broad categories of honeybee behaviors: the cell cleaning and capping behaviors, the brood and queen tending behaviors, comb building, and outside tasks. And within each of those categories, Dr. Winston shares with you the types of specific tasks that are in each of those. So for example, in the cell cleaning and capping task, they'll do some cell cleaning behaviors and some capping brood behaviors. In the brood and queen tending task, they'll tend brood and attend queens. In the comb building, cleaning, and food handling, they'll receive nectar, clean debris, pack pollen, build comb. And in the outside task, they'll ventilate the nest, guard, and forage. So I'm going to talk about all these in detail, so don't panic that I've gone through it fast. But what's most important about this graph is not only what the tasks are, but also the mean, which is the little circle, the common, and the average range of the ages of worker bees performing that task. So for example, the average or mean age of a worker bee performing the cell cleaning task is somewhere around 8 days old, right? You take that little bubble all the way down. But you'll see it's very common for workers that are 0 days old all the way to about 11 days old to perform the task. And even though it's common for them to do it in this range, a lot of workers will continue to perform this task all the way to almost 28 or so days of age. So this graphic shows you what is average, what is common, and what is the whole range of ages in which worker bees will perform that task. And generally speaking, as you move from the uppermost series of tasks to the bottommost series of tasks, you'll see that that bold bar, the one that's the common range, slowly slides to the right, showing that it's generally older and older and older and older bees that are performing that task essentially as they age. But I really wanted to explain this slide to you because to me, it really does a great job explaining that plasticity I was telling you about. The fact that bees don't only perform a task at one very rigid age, that there's actually quite a range of ages that they'll perform that task and so on. So what I've done in the subsequent slides, I've gone through all of the tasks, and I've included those means and average ranges at the top of each slide so that you'll get a good indication of when bees perform a given task.